Welcome back to Lore 2 RPG, where we dive deep into gaming's greatest stories. Today, we embark on perhaps our most ambitious journey yet, exploring the tragic and heroic tales of all the Lords of Cinder from the Dark Souls universe. Over the next few hours, we'll uncover the stories of those brave souls who sacrificed themselves to keep the first flame burning, each carrying their own burdens, their own reasons, and their own ultimate fate. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic adventure together as we explore the heroes who fed the flame. Chapter 1: The First Flame and the Origins of Lordship. To understand the Lords of Cinder, we must first understand the nature of the first flame itself. In the beginning, there was nothing but grey fog, ancient dragons, and everlasting stone. The world existed in a state of stagnation, without life, without death, without the very concept of change itself. But then, from the darkness, came fire. The first flame brought with it disparity, light and dark, life and death, heat and cold. From this flame emerged the Lord's souls, powerful fragments of its essence that would shape the destiny of all who followed. These souls were claimed by beings who would become the first lords: Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, the Witch of Izalith, Gravelord Nito, and the furtive pygmy whose role would prove more crucial than anyone could have imagined. But flames, even the first flame, are not eternal. They flicker, they fade, and without fuel, they die. As the flame began to wane, bringing with it the prospect of an age of dark, Gwyn made a choice that would echo through countless generations. He chose to sacrifice himself, linking his very soul to the dying flame to extend the Age of Fire. In doing so, he became the first Lord of Cinder. The term Lord of Cinder carries with it both honor and tragedy. These are beings who possessed souls powerful enough to serve as kindling for the first flame. Their very essence burned away to fuel the continuation of the Age of Fire. They are champions, heroes, and sacrificial victims all at once. Each linking of the flame creates a new Lord of Cinder, adding their strength to those who came before, creating an ever-growing repository of souls bound to the flame's will. The process of becoming a Lord of Cinder is not merely about power, though great power is certainly required. It demands a soul of sufficient magnitude to withstand the flame's hunger, if only briefly. It requires the ability to reach the kiln of the first flame, overcoming whatever guardians and obstacles stand in the way. Most importantly, it requires the willingness, whether voluntary or forced, to sacrifice oneself for the continuation of an age that may already be beyond saving. When a Lord of Cinder completes their sacrifice, they become forever changed. Their bodies are charred and marked by the flame they fed. Their souls become intertwined with the very essence of fire itself. Should they be resurrected, as often happens when the flame grows weak again, they bear the scars and power of their sacrifice, becoming beings caught between life and death, flesh and cinder. The cycle established by Gwyn's sacrifice would repeat countless times throughout history. When the flame grew weak, when the signs of the coming dark became apparent, new champions would emerge or be chosen to continue the cycle. Some would go willingly, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Others would be forced, driven by circumstance or the will of others, to a fate they never chose. Still others would refuse, leading to crisis and the desperate resurrection of past lords to fulfill the duty once more. This system, while successful in preventing the Age of Dark, came with its own costs. Each linking of the flame grew weaker than the last, requiring more frequent intervention. The world began to show signs of strain, with the undead curse spreading and lands being consumed by various forms of decay and madness. The very foundations of reality began to shift and warp under the weight of a cycle that was never meant to continue indefinitely. Yet for all its flaws, the cycle of fire-linking created legends. It gave rise to heroes whose names would be spoken with reverence and fear across generations. These Lords of Cinder, each with their own story of triumph and tragedy, became the pillars upon which the dying world attempted to maintain its existence. They are the subjects of our tale today, and their stories reveal the true cost of heroism in a world that demands the ultimate sacrifice. Chapter 2: Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. The First Sacrifice. Lord Gwyn stands as perhaps the most significant figure in all of Dark Souls lore, not merely because he was the first Lord of Cinder, but because his actions set in motion the entire cycle that would define the fate of the world for countless ages to come. Known as the Lord of Sunlight, Gwyn was a being of immense power and authority, ruling over the golden city of Anor Londo during the height of the Age of Fire. In his prime, Gwyn was a magnificent figure. Tall and imposing, with long silver hair and beard, he commanded the respect and loyalty of gods and men alike. His mastery over lightning was legendary, able to craft spears of pure sunlight that could pierce dragon scales and level mountains. The very concept of miracles, those divine interventions that draw upon faith and the power of the gods, trace their origins back to Gwyn's magnificent displays of power. Gwyn's rise to prominence came during the war against the ancient dragons, those primordial beings who ruled the world before the coming of fire. Alongside his allies, the Witch of Izalith with her flames of chaos, Gravelord Nito with his power over death, and Seath the Scaleless, the traitorous dragon who provided crucial knowledge about his kin. Gwyn waged a campaign that would reshape the very nature of existence. The war against the dragons was not merely a battle for territory or resources. It was a fundamental struggle between two incompatible forms of existence. The dragons represented the old world of stagnation, where nothing changed, nothing lived, and nothing died. The lords, empowered by the first flame, embodied change, growth, and the dynamic forces that would define the new age. Gwyn's lightning spears, piercing the immortal scales of the dragons, symbolized this transformation from the static to the dynamic, from the eternal to the temporal. Victory in this war established Gwyn as the supreme ruler of the new age. From his throne in Anor Londo, he presided over a golden period of prosperity and expansion. His knights, the most famous being the legendary Artorias, carried his banner to distant lands. His children, Gwynevere, Gwyndolin, the Nameless King, and Filianore, represented different aspects of his power and influence. The very concept of a lordship, as understood throughout the series, stems from Gwyn's example and the system he established. But Gwyn's greatest strength may have also been his greatest weakness: his fear of the dark. The furtive pygmy, that forgotten fourth lord who claimed the dark soul from the first flame, represented something that Gwyn could not control or understand. The dark was the natural opposite of his light, and within it lay the potential for humanity to claim a power that could rival or even surpass that of the gods. This fear led Gwyn to take drastic measures. He branded humans with the dark sign, a curse that would prevent them from fully embracing their dark nature, but would also doom them to cycles of death and rebirth as undead. He scattered pieces of the dark soul to weaken it, and he worked tirelessly to suppress any manifestation of humanity's true potential. These actions, while successful in maintaining his rule, would have consequences that echoed through every subsequent age. As the first flame began to fade, Gwyn faced a choice that would define not only his legacy, but the fate of all existence. He could allow the flame to die naturally, ushering in the age of dark that seemed to be the natural progression of things. Or he could sacrifice himself to rekindle the flame, extending the age of fire at the cost of his own existence. Driven by his fear of the dark and his desire to preserve the world he had built, Gwyn chose sacrifice. he divided his powerful soul among his children and closest allies, giving them strength to rule in his absence. Then, taking only his faithful knights as companions, he marched to the kiln of the first flame. There, in that sacred place where the fire first sparked into existence, Gwyn performed the ultimate act of sacrifice. The linking of the fire was not a peaceful death. It was a burning, consuming process that stripped away everything that made Gwyn who he was. His consciousness, his memories, his very identity were fed to the hungry flame. What remained was a hollow shell, a guardian bound to protect the fire from any who might threaten it, but no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. By the time the chosen undead encounters Gwyn in the first Dark Souls, he is but a shadow of his former magnificence. His golden armor is tarnished and worn, his great lightning spears reduced to weak copies of their former glory. He moves with the mechanical precision of a construct rather than the grace of a living being. The proud Lord of Sunlight has become Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, his very title reflecting the transformation from living flame to burnt residue. Yet even in this diminished state, Gwyn remains a formidable opponent. His skill with the blade, honed over countless ages, remains intact. His determination to protect the flame never wavers. The fight against Gwyn is not merely a battle of strength, but a test of worthiness. Only one capable of defeating the first Lord of Cinder has the power necessary to either continue the cycle by linking the flame themselves, or to break it by allowing the Age of Dark to finally begin. The music that accompanies this confrontation tells its own story. Gwyn's theme, Plin Plin Plon, is not the triumphant fanfare one might expect for such a legendary figure. Instead, it is a melancholy piano piece, sparse and haunting, reflecting the tragedy of what Gwyn has become. It speaks of nobility lost, of sacrifice unrewarded, of a hero who saved the world by destroying himself. Gwyn's legacy extends far beyond his own story. Every subsequent Lord of Cinder follows the path he established. Every character who faces the choice between linking the flame and embracing the dark does so in the shadow of his decision. The very structure of the world, with its emphasis on duty, sacrifice, and the suppression of the dark, reflects the choices he made and the fears that drove him. Some view Gwyn as a tragic hero, a being who made the ultimate sacrifice to save the world from a darkness he could not understand. Others see him as a tyrant, whose fear and prejudice condemned countless generations to suffering in service of a dying age. Perhaps the truth contains elements of both perspectives. Gwyn was a product of his time and circumstances, a powerful being faced with an impossible choice who did what he believed was right, regardless of the personal cost. What cannot be disputed is the magnitude of his impact on the world of Dark Souls. Every kingdom that rises and falls, every hero that challenges fate, every undead that struggles against the curse, does so in a world shaped by Gwyn's choices. He is the first link in a chain that binds the entire cosmos to a cycle of fire and ash, light and dark, hope and despair. His story serves as both inspiration and warning to those who would follow in his footsteps. It shows the heights that can be achieved through determination and sacrifice, but also the price that such achievements demand. In becoming the first Lord of Cinder, Gwyn transcended his mortality but lost his humanity. He saved the world but doomed it to an endless cycle of decay and renewal. He became a legend, but legends, as we learn throughout the Dark Souls series, are often far more complex and tragic than the stories would have us believe. Chapter 3. The Abyss Watchers, Guardians, consumed by their purpose. The tale of the Abyss Watchers is perhaps one of the most tragic in all of Dark Souls lore, a story of heroes who became so dedicated to fighting darkness that they themselves became consumed by it. Known formally as the Undead Legion of Farron, These warriors represented the best intentions of heroism, twisted into something far more complex and tragic. To understand the Abyss Watchers, we must first understand their inspiration, Artorius the Abyss Walker. This legendary knight of Gwyn was renowned for his courage and skill, particularly in his battles against the creatures of the Abyss. When the ancient land of Ulachile fell to the corruption of the Abyss through their experiments with the dark, it was Artorius who took upon himself the mission to cleanse this spreading darkness. The legend tells of Artorius successfully completing his mission, standing as a beacon of hope against the encroaching void. But legends, as we often discover in the Dark Souls universe, can be far from the truth. In reality, Artorius fell to the very corruption he sought to destroy, becoming twisted and maddened by the Abyss's influence. It was actually the intervention of a time-traveling chosen undead that ultimately saved Ulachile, though history would remember it as Artorius' triumph. Regardless of the truth behind the legend, the story of Artorius inspired many. Chief among these admirers were the warriors who would become the Abyss Watchers. These men and women, drawn from various backgrounds and united by their dedication to fighting the Abyss, formed the undead legion of Farron. Their base of operations was Farron Keep, a fortress built in the swamplands that had once been part of Ulachile itself. The Abyss Watchers distinguished themselves not merely through their dedication to their cause, but through a ritual that bound them together in ways that transcended normal brotherhood. They partook of what they called wolf blood, a mystical substance that linked their souls together. This wolf blood was connected to the memory and essence of Artorius himself, who was often symbolically represented by wolves, particularly his loyal companion Sif. The consumption of wolf blood had profound effects on the Abyss Watchers. Physically, it enhanced their abilities, granting them the strength and agility needed to combat the creatures of the Abyss. They adopted fighting styles reminiscent of Artorius himself, wielding large swords with graceful acrobatic movements that seemed to dance between aggression and artistry. Their signature weapon, the Farron Greatsword, was designed to mimic the legendary blade of their hero, paired with a dagger for parrying and additional strikes. But the wolf blood did more than enhance their physical capabilities. It bound their souls together in an unprecedented way, creating a shared consciousness among all who partook of it. This meant that while they remained individual beings with their own thoughts and personalities, their souls were fundamentally linked to what they called the soul of the wolf blood master, the essence of Artorius himself. This soul binding had both advantages and drawbacks. On the positive side, it created an unparalleled unity among the Abyss Watchers. They could coordinate their actions with supernatural precision, fight as a perfect unit, and share in each other's strength and knowledge. When one Watcher learned a new technique or discovered a weakness in an abyssal creature, that knowledge would flow to all the others through their shared soul. However, this same connection would prove to be their downfall. The Abyss Watchers adopted an extremely aggressive stance against anything even remotely connected to the Abyss or its corruption. This zero-tolerance approach led them to destroy entire settlements and regions based on the mere suspicion of corruption. Their paranoia was not entirely unfounded. The Abyss was indeed a spreading corruption that could consume entire regions if left unchecked. However, their extreme methods made them as feared as they were respected. Communities would tremble at the sight of the Abyss Watchers' distinctive pointed helms, knowing that their arrival often meant destruction, whether corruption was actually present or not. The irony of their situation became apparent as time went on. In their zealous dedication to fighting the Abyss Watchers began to exhibit signs of the very corruption they sought to destroy. Their shared soul, while granting them great power, also made them vulnerable to collective corruption. When abyssal influence touched one watcher, it could potentially spread to all of them through their mystical connection. This corruption manifested in several ways. Some Abyss Watchers began to display the red eyes that were characteristic of abyssal influence. These corrupted Watchers would attack not only external threats, but their own brothers, creating internal conflict within the Legion. The shared soul that had been their greatest strength became a conduit for the very corruption they fought against. The situation in Farron Keep deteriorated rapidly. The swamplands themselves became increasingly toxic and dangerous, filled with hostile creatures and poisonous waters. The Old Wolf of Farron, a mystical guardian connected to the legacy of Artorias, established the Watchdogs of Farron Covenant to protect the area, but even this was insufficient to stem the decay. As the Abyss Watchers battled not only external corruption but internal strife, their effectiveness as guardians diminished. They became trapped in a cycle of fighting each other as much as they fought the Abyss. The very unity that had made them powerful now ensured that corruption could spread among them like wildfire. Despite their internal struggles, or perhaps because of them, the Abyss Watchers eventually linked the First Flame and became Lords of Cinder. The exact circumstances of this linking remain unclear. Some sources suggest that they worked together as a unified force to accomplish this feat, while others imply that only one among them actually performed the linking, with the shared soul allowing all of them to be considered Lords of Cinder. The linking of the flame did not resolve their internal conflicts. If anything, it may have exacerbated them. The process of becoming the Lords of Cinder typically involves a fundamental transformation of the being involved, and for the Abyss Watchers, this transformation seems to have further destabilized their already fragile unity. When the bells tolled to summon the Lords of Cinder back to their duty, the Abyss Watchers answered the call, but not in the way that was intended. They returned to their posts in Farron Keep, but their internal conflict continued unabated. By the time the Ashen One encounters them, they are locked in an eternal battle with themselves, corrupted Watchers fighting uncorrupted ones in an endless cycle of violence. The boss battle against the Abyss Watchers perfectly encapsulates their tragic story. The fight begins with multiple Abyss Watchers present in the arena, some fighting the player while others fight each other. Those with red eyes, indicating abyssal corruption, will attack anyone in sight, including their fellow Watchers. This creates a chaotic battlefield where alliances shift moment by moment, and the player can find themselves temporarily aided by the very enemies they're trying to defeat. When the first phase of the battle concludes and one Watcher absorbs the blood of his fallen brothers to enter the second phase, we see the other side of their tragedy. The empowered Watcher becomes wreathed in flame, wielding fire, as well as his signature sword techniques. This represents the culmination of their power as Lords of Cinder, but also their isolation. The unity they once shared has been replaced by solitary strength, the individual triumphing over the collective at the cost of everything that once made them who they were. The arena itself tells a story of decay and conflict. Broken weapons and armor litter the ground, evidence of countless battles fought between the Watchers themselves. The very architecture of Farron Keep shows signs of the spreading corruption and the failure of the Watchers to contain it. What was once a proud fortress dedicated to fighting the Abyss has become a monument to the failure of absolute dedication taken to extremes. The Abyss. Watcher's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of zealotry and the corruption that can come from fighting monsters. Their noble intentions, to protect the world from the spreading darkness of the Abyss, led them to adopt increasingly extreme methods that ultimately corrupted them in ways far more subtle than the obvious darkness they fought against. They became so focused on their enemy that they lost sight of what they were supposed to be protecting. Their legacy is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, they represent the highest ideals of heroism, selfless dedication to protecting others, willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, and unwavering commitment to their principles. On the other hand, they demonstrate how these same virtues can become vices when taken to extremes, how the fight against corruption can itself become a form of corruption. The connection to Artorias adds another layer of tragedy to their story. They sought to emulate a hero whose legend was built on a lie, following in the footsteps of someone who had actually failed in his mission. Yet in doing so, they created their own form of heroism, flawed though it may have been. They became the thing they admired, but in becoming it, they discovered the true cost of such dedication. In the broader context of the Dark Souls narrative, the Abyss Watchers represent one possible path for those who would be heroes. They show what happens when the desire to protect becomes an obsession, when unity becomes a vulnerability, and when the fight against darkness requires one to embrace methods that might themselves be questionable. They are neither pure heroes nor simple villains, but complex beings whose good intentions led them down a path that ultimately consumed them. Their tale resonates because it reflects real-world concerns about extremism, the corruption of institutions, and the way that noble causes can be twisted into something harmful. The Abyss Watchers believed they were doing the right thing, and in many ways they were. But their story reminds us that good intentions are not always enough, and that the road to tragedy is often paved with the noblest of purposes. Chapter 4. Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, the saint who became a monster. Among all the Lords of Cinder, none presents a more disturbing transformation from holy to horrific than Aldrich, the Devourer of Gods. His story is one of corruption from within, of a religious figure whose dark appetites grew until they consumed not only his humanity, but threatened the very gods themselves. Aldrich represents perhaps the most sinister of all the Lords of Cinder, for he alone among them achieved his status not through noble sacrifice, but through sheer, terrible might acquired through unspeakable acts. Aldrich began his existence as a cleric, a servant of the gods dedicated to the spiritual well-being of his flock. In the early days, he would have been a figure of respect and authority, someone whom people looked to for guidance and comfort in times of trouble. The religious hierarchy of the Dark Souls world placed great importance on such figures, seeing them as intermediaries between the mortal realm and the divine powers that shaped existence. But something went wrong with Aldrich's spiritual development. Perhaps it was a gradual corruption, a slow slide from righteousness into darkness. Perhaps it was a sudden revelation or temptation that overwhelmed his moral restraints. Whatever the cause, Aldrich developed what would politely be called an unusual appetite. He began to consume human flesh. At first, this horrifying practice might have been hidden, perhaps rationalized as some form of religious ritual or spiritual necessity. But appetites, once indulged, have a tendency to grow. What began as occasional consumption became regular feeding. What started as secretive acts became more open displays of his monstrous nature. Aldrich ate so many people that his body began to transform, bloating and softening until he became something barely recognizable as human. The consumption of human flesh did more than merely change Aldrich's physical form. In the world of Dark Souls, souls carry power, and the consumption of souls can grant strength to the consumer. By devouring so many humans, Aldrich was essentially accumulating their souls, their life force, their very essence. This made him incredibly powerful, but it also fundamentally changed his nature. He became less human and more monster with each victim consumed. As his appetite grew and his form became increasingly grotesque, Aldrich posed a problem for the religious authorities. They could not simply ignore or hide someone who had become so obviously monstrous, yet his power had grown to the point where he could not easily be destroyed. The solution they chose was to confine him in the Cathedral of the Deep, a massive religious structure where he could be contained while they decided what to do with him. The Cathedral of the Deep had originally been dedicated to very different purposes. It was a place where the faithful of the Way of White came to combat the horrors that emerged from something called the Deep. The Deep itself was a mysterious realm connected to stagnant souls and dark waters, a place where the spiritual residue of the dead seemed to collect and fester. The deacons and clerics of the cathedral were supposed to guard against the creatures and corruption that emerged from this place, but Aldrich's presence changed everything. Rather than being contained by the cathedral, he began to corrupt it. His vision of the future, his dreams of what the world could become, started to influence the very people who were supposed to be guarding him. He proclaimed that the age of fire was ending and that it should be replaced by an age of the deep sea, where the world would be covered by dark waters and the dregs of humanity would sink to the ocean floor to serve as the foundation for a new form of existence. This vision was seductive to those who had grown tired of the endless cycle of fire linking and the suffering it brought. The deacons and clerics of the Cathedral of the Deep began to listen to Aldrich's teachings, to see him not as a monster to be contained, but as a prophet revealing a new path forward. They abandoned their traditional duties and embraced Aldrich as the Saint of the Deep, a holy figure who would lead them into this new age. The transformation of the Cathedral of the Deep from a bastion against corruption to a center of worship for that same corruption was gradual but complete. The deacons, once dedicated to fighting the creatures of the deep, began to use sorceries associated with it instead of their traditional miracles. They covered statues and abandoned their previous religious symbols in favor of those connected to Aldrich and his vision. Aldrich's influence extended beyond simple religious conversion. The Pontiff Suleiman, a powerful figure from the distant land of Erythil, became connected to Aldrich's cause. Suleiman was a master manipulator and sorcerer who saw opportunity in Aldrich's growing power. The two formed an alliance that would have far-reaching consequences for the world. Under Suleiman's guidance and with the support of his growing cult, Aldrich's ambitions expanded beyond merely human prey. He began to dream of consuming the gods themselves, believing that by devouring divine beings, he could absorb their power and perhaps achieve a form of immortality or transcendence that would allow him to reshape the world according to his vision. The process of consuming gods was far more complex than simply eating human beings. Gods were vastly more powerful than mortals, and their essence was fundamentally different. To successfully devour a god, Aldrich would need to be far more powerful than he already was. This need for additional strength may have been what motivated him to link the first flame and become a Lord of Cinder. The linking of the flame was not a voluntary act on Aldrich's part. By this time, his monstrous nature and cannibalistic practices were well known, and he was certainly not the kind of figure that would normally be chosen for such a sacred duty. However, the sheer magnitude of his accumulated power, gained through consuming countless souls, made him a viable candidate regardless of his moral character. The transformation into a Lord of Cinder changed Aldrich in fundamental ways. His already grotesque form became even more monstrous, turning into a writhing mass of dark sludge filled with bones and partially digested remains. But it also granted him the power he needed to pursue his ultimate goal, the consumption of the gods themselves. Working with Pontiff Suleiman, Aldrich set his sights on Anor Londo, the legendary city of the gods. Suleiman had already infiltrated the city and taken control of much of its operations. When the time came for Aldrich to be resurrected as a Lord of Cinder to fulfill his duty to the flame, he instead used this resurrection as an opportunity to travel to Anor Londo and begin his divine feast. The first god to fall to Aldrich's appetite was Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun, youngest child of Lord Gwyn. Gwyndolin had remained in Anor Londo long after the other gods had departed, maintaining the illusion of the city's former glory and serving as a guardian of his father's legacy. Sulivan imprisoned Gwyndolin and offered him to Aldrich as the first course in his divine banquet. The consumption of Gwyndolin was not a quick or merciful process. Aldrich slowly devoured the god over an extended period, savouring both the physical act and the absorption of divine power. This prolonged consumption had several effects on Aldrich. He gained access to some of Gwyndolin's abilities, including mastery over certain forms of magic and the power to use the god's signature weapons. But the consumption also granted Aldrich visions and dreams that expanded his understanding of the gods and their powers. In his dreams while devouring Gwyndolin, Aldrich perceived the form of a young, pale girl in hiding. This vision was likely of Priscilla, the crossbreed, a mysterious figure with the power of life hunt, an ability so dangerous that even the gods feared it. This suggests that Aldrich's ultimate goal was not merely to consume gods randomly, but to specifically target those with the most powerful and dangerous abilities. The scene that greets the Ashen One when they finally encounter Aldrich in Anor Londo is one of pure horror. The once majestic cathedral where Ornstein and Smaug once stood guard has been transformed into a feeding ground. Aldrich's massive slug-like form fills much of the chamber, a writhing mass of dark sludge studded with bones and crowned by the upper torso of the half-digested Gwyndolin. The battle against Aldrich is as much a battle against his victim as against the monster himself. Gwyndolин's body serves as Aldrich's primary means of interaction with the world, wielding the god's bow and catalyst, while Aldrich's true form lurks beneath. The twisted symbiosis between predator and prey creates a uniquely disturbing opponent, one that combines the elegant magical attacks of a god with the raw, overwhelming hunger of a monster. Throughout the fight, the sounds of Gwyndolин's suffering can be heard, suggesting that some awareness remains within the consumed god. This adds a layer of tragedy to an already horrific encounter. Gwyndolin, who had dedicated his existence to maintaining his father's legacy and protecting Anor Londo, has become an unwilling puppet in his own consumption. Aldrich's moveset in battle reflects both his nature as a consumer of gods and his mastery over the powers of the deep. His attacks combine elements of Gwyndolин's original abilities with new powers derived from his connection to dark waters and stagnant souls. The arena itself becomes a hazard as Aldrich moves through it, his massive form capable of repositioning itself through some form of mystical locomotion that allows him to emerge from the floor at different locations. The implications of Aldrich's actions extend far beyond the immediate horror of his cannibalism. By consuming Gwyndolin, he has disrupted one of the last connections between the current age and the golden era of the gods. Gwyndolin was not merely a powerful individual, but a guardian of knowledge, tradition, and divine authority. His consumption represents a fundamental break with the past and the institutions that have maintained order throughout the Age of Fire. Furthermore, Aldrich's vision of the Age of the Deep Sea represents a complete rejection of the cycle of fire linking that has defined the world's history. Where others have sought to maintain or reform the existing order, Aldrich advocates for its complete destruction and replacement. His is not a vision of improvement, but of transformation so radical that it would render the current world unrecognizable. The religious aspects of Aldrich's transformation cannot be ignored. He began as a cleric, a servant of the gods, yet he ultimately became their destroyer. This represents perhaps the ultimate form of apostasy, not merely abandoning one's faith, but actively working to destroy the objects of that faith. Yet his followers continue to regard him as a saint, suggesting that they see his actions not as betrayal but as revelation. the corruption of the Cathedral of the Deep under Aldrich's influence mirrors many real-world examples of religious institutions being corrupted from within. The gradual transformation of the deacons from guardians against corruption to embracers of it shows how even the most dedicated servants can be led astray when presented with a sufficiently compelling alternative vision. Aldrich's story also raises questions about the nature of power and its corrupting influence. His strength came not from noble deeds or divine blessing, but from the consumption of others. This accumulation of power through predation represents a dark alternative to the traditional paths of heroism and sacrifice that characterize other Lords of Cinder. Where others gave of themselves, Aldrich took from others. The relationship between Aldrich and Pontiff Suleiman adds another dimension to his story. Suleiman, despite being a powerful sorcerer and manipulator in his own right, chose to ally with Aldrich rather than oppose him. This suggests that Aldrich's power and vision were compelling enough to attract even those who might have been expected to resist him. The alliance between the two represents a convergence of different forms of corruption: Aldrich's consuming hunger and Suleiman's cold ambition. In the broader narrative of Dark Souls III, Aldrich serves as a dark mirror to the other Lords of Cinder. Where the Abyss Watchers were corrupted by their noble intentions, Aldrich was corrupted by base appetites. Where Yhorm was motivated by duty to his people, Aldrich was motivated purely by self-interest. Where the twin princes rejected their fate out of wisdom or cowardice, Aldrich embraced his fate as an opportunity for greater predation. Yet, for all his monstrosity, Aldrich achieved what he set out to accomplish. He gained incredible power, he influenced countless followers, and he successfully began consuming the gods themselves. In terms of pure effectiveness, he may be the most successful of all the Lords of Cinder, having used his position to advance his own agenda rather than simply fulfilling the duty imposed upon him. The defeat of Aldrich by the Ashen One represents more than just the elimination of a powerful enemy. It represents the ending of a vision of the future that would have fundamentally transformed the world. The Age of the Deep Sea dies with Aldrich, leaving only the traditional options of linking the fire or embracing the Age of Dark. In destroying Aldrich, the Ashen One preserves the existing order, for better or worse. Aldrich's legacy lives on in the corruption he spread and the institutions he influenced. The Cathedral of the Deep remains a testament to his power to corrupt and transform. The deacons who served him continue to practice their dark arts even after his death. The very concept of the deep as an alternative to both fire and dark continues to influence those who seek a different path forward. In examining Aldrich's story, we see themes of corruption, power, religious manipulation, and the dangers of unchecked appetite. His transformation from holy man to monster serves as a warning about the corrupting influence of power and the way that even the most sacred institutions can be turned to dark purposes. He represents the shadow side of authority, the potential for those entrusted with spiritual guidance to become predators upon those they are meant to protect. Chapter 5: Yhorm the Giant, the Reluctant King's Burden. The tale of Yhorm the Giant stands apart from the other Lords of Cinder as a story of duty, sacrifice, and the crushing weight of good intentions gone tragically wrong. Where other lords were driven by ambition, corruption, or noble obsession, Yhorm's path to becoming a Lord of Cinder was paved with genuine love for his people and a desperate desire to protect them from a threat he could not fully understand. Yhorm was born into a legacy of conquest. As the descendant of an ancient conqueror who had subjugated the people of what would become the profaned capital, he inherited not only power, but also the complex relationship between ruler and ruled that comes from such a history. By rights, Yhorm should have been feared and hated by the very people his ancestor had conquered. Instead, something remarkable happened. The people themselves asked him to lead them. This request speaks to the character of both Yhorm and the people of the profaned capital. Despite his intimidating size and the history of his bloodline, Yhorm must have demonstrated qualities that inspired trust and respect. The people saw in him not an oppressor, but a protector, someone who could serve as both their shield against external threats and their sword against injustice. It was a burden that Yhorm accepted willingly, understanding the responsibility that came with such trust. As a ruler, Yhorm distinguished himself through his dedication to his people's welfare. He fought not from the safety of a throne room, but as a frontline warrior, often serving as a one-man vanguard in battles against threats to his kingdom. His enormous size and strength made him a formidable opponent, capable of taking on entire armies single-handedly. But more than his physical prowess, it was his willingness to put himself at risk for others that truly defined his leadership. Yhorm's fighting style reflected his character. He wielded a massive machete and, initially, a great shield that served as protection in battle. This combination of offense and defense symbolized his role as both warrior and protector. He would strike down his kingdom's enemies while using his shield to protect his people from harm. It was a balanced approach that served him well in many conflicts. However, this balance was shattered by personal tragedy. At some point during his reign, Yhorm lost someone dear to him. The exact identity of this person is not specified in the law, but their importance to Yhorm cannot be overstated. The loss was so devastating that it fundamentally changed how he approached both battle and life. In his grief and anger, Yhorm abandoned his great shield entirely, notching his machete to allow for two-handed use and adopting a more aggressive, reckless fighting style. This transformation from balanced warrior to aggressive berserker reflected the change in Yhorm's emotional state. Where once he had fought to protect, now he fought with a fury born of loss and pain. The abandonment of his shield was symbolic. He no longer prioritized his own defense, but instead focused entirely on destroying his enemies, regardless of the risk to himself. It was the behavior of someone who had lost something precious and was determined that nothing else would be taken from him. Despite this personal tragedy, or perhaps because of it, Yhorm continued to be a beloved ruler. His people understood his grief and respected his dedication to their protection. When doubts arose about his commitment to their welfare, Yhorm made an extraordinary gesture of trust. He gave his people a weapon specifically designed to kill giants like himself. The Storm Ruler, a legendary blade capable of commanding the power of storms to bring down even the mightiest opponents. This act demonstrated remarkable confidence in both his people's judgment and his own righteousness. By giving them the means to destroy him, Yhorm was essentially saying that he trusted them to use that power only if he truly betrayed their trust or became a threat to their well-being. It was a gesture unprecedented in the annals of rulership, one that spoke to both his humility and his genuine love for his subjects. The Storm Ruler was not merely a weapon, but a covenant between ruler and ruled. It represented the idea that power should be held accountable, that even the mightiest king should be subject to the will of his people if he strayed from the path of righteousness. By creating and distributing this weapon, Yhorm was establishing a form of checks and balances that ensured his power could not be abused without consequence. But Yhorm's greatest test came not from external enemies or internal strife, but from a supernatural threat that none of his strength or wisdom could have prepared him for. The profaned flame, a terrible fire that would never be extinguished, fell from the sky and began to consume his kingdom. This flame was unlike any natural fire. It burned only human flesh, leaving everything else untouched, and it could not be put out by any conventional means. The origin of the profaned flame was connected to a curse triggered by 4 women who were relatives of an oracle. These women, consumed by greed and carelessness, somehow activated this terrible curse that brought the flame down upon the kingdom. The profaned flame represented a form of punishment, or cosmic retribution, a force of destruction that specifically targeted humanity. Faced with this unprecedented threat to his people, Yhorm found himself in an impossible situation. His physical strength, which had served him so well against conventional enemies, was useless against a supernatural flame that could not be fought with sword or shield. His traditional role as protector was meaningless when the threat came not from invading armies, but from forces beyond mortal comprehension. In desperation, Yhorm sought a solution in the most drastic action available to him, linking the first flame to become a Lord of Cinder. The logic was sound in its desperation. By gaining the power of a Lord of Cinder, perhaps he could find a way to combat or control the profaned flame. If nothing else, the great sacrifice might appease whatever cosmic forces had brought this punishment upon his kingdom. The decision to link the flame was not made lightly. Yhorm understood that becoming a Lord of Cinder meant sacrificing his own life and identity in service to a larger cosmic order. But faced with the alternative, watching his beloved people burn in a fire that could never be extinguished, he chose to make the ultimate sacrifice. His love for his subjects outweighed his desire for personal survival. Before undertaking this final journey, Yhorm made one last gesture that would prove prophetic. He had kept one copy of the Storm Ruler for himself, but he gave the second copy to a dear friend, Sigurd of Katarina, a knight from a distant land who had somehow earned Yhorm's trust and affection. With this weapon came a terrible request. If Yhorm should ever fall to despair or madness, if he should become a threat to the very people he sought to protect, Sigurd was to use the Storm Ruler to end his suffering. This request reveals the depth of Yhorm's wisdom and his understanding of the costs of power. He knew that the transformation into a Lord of Cinder might change him in fundamental ways, that the being who returned might not be the same person who made the sacrifice. By entrusting Sigurd with the means to destroy him, Yhorm was ensuring that his love for his people would be honored even if he himself was no longer capable of honoring it. The linking of the flame did not achieve what Yhorm had hoped. Despite his sacrifice, despite the immense power he gained as a Lord of Cinder, the profaned flame was not extinguished. If anything, the situation may have worsened. Some accounts suggest that the flame actually intensified after his transformation, consuming even more of his people and reducing much of the profaned capital to ash and bone. When Yhorm was eventually resurrected to fulfill his duty as a Lord of Cinder, he awoke to find his worst nightmare realized. His kingdom lay in ruins, his people were dead or transformed into monsters, and the profaned flame still burned as fiercely as ever. The sacrifice that was supposed to save everything had accomplished nothing except to delay his witnessing of its destruction. The Yhorm that the Ashen One encounters is a broken being, consumed by grief and driven to madness by the failure of his ultimate sacrifice. The throne room where he sits is a charnel house, filled with the scorched remains of his subjects. The very people he had died to protect had become the fuel for the fire he had failed to extinguish. Worse still, some of these remains show signs of having wielded storm rulers, suggesting that some of his people had tried to fight him and failed, the ultimate betrayal of the trust he had placed in them. The giant who once fought as a protector now shows no recognition of friend or foe. His red eyes glow with the same mad fury that characterizes other beings consumed by despair or corruption. When Sigurd arrives to fulfill his promise, Yhorm attacks him with the same mindless aggression he shows toward any intruder. The loving ruler who had once treasured his friend's companionship no longer recognizes the one person who might have brought him comfort. The battle against Yhorm is unique among the Lord of Cinder encounters, because it explicitly requires the use of the Storm Ruler to achieve victory. While other bosses can be defeated through conventional means, Yhorm's immense size and strength make him nearly invulnerable to normal weapons. The Storm Ruler's power to command storms and bring down giants is essential to the fight, creating a mechanical reflection of the lore. Only the weapon he himself provided can bring him peace. If Sigurd survives the encounter, his dialogue after Yhorm's defeat reveals the true tragedy of the situation. He speaks of fulfilling a promise to an old friend, of doing what had to be done despite the pain it caused him. The implication is that some part of Sigurd's attack was motivated not by duty, but by mercy. That killing Yhorm was an act of love, freeing him from a torment that had become unbearable. The Storm Ruler found in Yhorm's throne room after his defeat tells its own story. This weapon, identical to the one carried by Sigurd, represents the completion of the covenant between ruler and ruled. In death, Yhorm has finally been held accountable by the weapon he himself provided, though not in the way he had originally intended. The tool meant to protect his people from a tyrannical king instead became the instrument of mercy for a mad one. Yhorm's story serves as a meditation on the limits of good intentions and the tragedy of noble sacrifice that achieves nothing. Unlike other Lords of Cinder, who were corrupted by their own flaws or driven by selfish motives, Yhorm was motivated throughout by genuine love and concern for others. Yet this very love led him to make choices that ultimately brought about the destruction he sought to prevent. The relationship between Yhorm and Sigurd adds depth to this tragedy. Here were two beings from different cultures and backgrounds who found genuine friendship and mutual respect. Sigurd's willingness to carry out his terrible promise speaks to the strength of their bond and the respect he held for Yhorm's judgment. Even knowing the pain it would cause him, Sigurd honored his commitment because he understood that it was what his friend would have wanted. The profaned capital itself serves as a monument to the failure of good intentions. Once a prosperous kingdom ruled by a beloved giant, it has become a wasteland of ash and bone. The architecture that remains shows signs of past glory, but it is overwhelmed by the evidence of destruction and death. The very name profaned suggests that something sacred has been violated or corrupted, though whether this refers to the kingdom, the flame, or Yhorm himself remains ambiguous. In the broader context of Dark Souls lore, Yhorm represents the tragic hero who sacrifices everything for others and receives nothing but suffering in return. His story challenges the assumption that noble motives lead to positive outcomes, showing instead how even the most selfless actions can have unintended consequences. The cosmic forces at play in the Dark Souls universe are indifferent to human suffering and seem to delight in subverting attempts at heroic intervention. The theme of isolation runs throughout Yhorm's tale. Despite being surrounded by subjects who loved him and having at least one true friend, Yhorm ultimately faced his greatest challenges alone. The burden of leadership, the weight of responsibility, and the agony of failure were his to bear without anyone who could truly understand or share the load. Even his transformation into a Lord of Cinder, supposedly the highest honor possible, became just another form of isolation as it separated him from his humanity and his connection to others. Yhorm's legacy is one of questions rather than answers. What could he have done differently? Was there any solution to the threat of the profaned flame? Or was his kingdom doomed regardless of his actions? Did his sacrifice accomplish anything at all? Or was it merely a gesture that delayed the inevitable? These questions have no clear answers, which is perhaps fitting for a story that deals with the incomprehensible forces that shape fate in the Dark Souls universe. The weapons that can be created from Yhorm's soul after his defeat reflect different aspects of his character. Yhorm's great machete represents his role as a warrior and protector, while Yhorm's great shield represents the defense he abandoned in his grief. Together, they tell the story of a complete warrior who became incomplete through loss, who gave up balance in favor of fury, and who ultimately paid the price for that choice. In examining Yhorm's story, we see themes of duty, sacrifice, the burden of leadership, and the tragedy of good intentions. His tale serves as a reminder that in the Dark Souls universe, as in our own world, being right is not enough. Being good is not enough. And even being willing to sacrifice everything for others is not enough to guarantee a positive outcome. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are not those that befall the wicked, but those that destroy the good, despite their best efforts to do right. Chapter 6. The Twin Princes, a refusal born of wisdom or fear, in the crumbling spires of Lothric Castle, atop the highest tower where the winds carry whispers of ages past, dwell perhaps the most enigmatic of all the Lords of Cinder, Lorien, Elder Prince, and Lothric, Younger Prince. Their story is one of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the courage to say no in a world that demands absolute obedience to cosmic duty. Known collectively as the Twin Princes, they represent the only Lords of Cinder who consciously chose to reject their fate, preferring to watch the world burn rather than perpetuate a cycle they deemed fundamentally flawed. To understand the Twin Princes, we must first understand the kingdom of Lothric itself and the desperate circumstances that led to their birth. Lothric was a realm obsessed with producing a worthy heir to link the first flame. The royal bloodline had devoted generations to this singular purpose, engaging in increasingly desperate measures to create a child capable of becoming a Lord of Cinder. This obsession with fire linking had become the defining characteristic of the kingdom's identity and purpose. The bloodline of Lothric traced its origins back to the Age of Gods, with strong connections to the royal family of Anor Londo. Queen Guinevere, daughter of Lord Gwyn himself, had left her father's city and eventually married into the Lothric royal line, bringing with her divine blood and the blessings associated with her celestial heritage. This divine ancestry was seen as crucial to producing an heir capable of withstanding the terrible power of the first flame. However, divine blood alone proved insufficient for the task at hand. The exact nature of these practices is left to the imagination, but they clearly involved violations of natural law and moral boundaries that even the desperate royal family found difficult to justify. Into this environment of desperation and moral compromise were born the three princes: Lorien, the eldest, Lothric, the younger, and Ocelot, whose fate would become entangled with the madness of their father, King Oceiros. Each child represented different aspects of their parents' hopes and the kingdom's desperate needs. Lorien, the elder prince, embodied everything the kingdom hoped for in a potential Lord of Cinder. He was physically powerful, skilled in combat, and possessed of the kind of heroic nature that legends are made of. His greatest achievement came in his single-handed defeat of the Demon Prince, a powerful remnant of the Chaos demons that had plagued the world since the Witch of Izalith's failed attempt to recreate the First Flame. This victory was so significant that it left permanent marks on Lorien. His sword remained eternally wreathed in the flames of his fallen enemy, a constant reminder of his triumph over one of the most dangerous beings in existence. But Lorien's strength was not merely physical. He possessed a noble character that made him beloved by those who served under him and respected by his enemies. His willingness to lead from the front, to face danger before asking others to do so, and his genuine care for the welfare of his people marked him as a true leader. In many ways, he represented the ideal of knightly virtue that the kingdom of Lothric aspired to embody. Lothric, the younger prince, was born with a very different destiny. While Lorien had been shaped as a warrior and leader, Lothric was specifically intended to be the one who would link the first flame. From birth, he was groomed for this singular purpose, educated in the arts and knowledge necessary to understand the cosmic forces he would one day be expected to master. His tutors included some of the most learned scholars in the realm, and his education encompassed not only traditional subjects, but esoteric knowledge about the nature of souls, fire, and the fundamental forces that shaped reality. However, this education may have been more thorough than the royal family intended. As Lothric learned about the history of fire linking, about the endless cycle of decay and renewal that had characterized the world for countless ages, he began to question whether this cycle was truly beneficial or necessary. His studies revealed the costs of maintaining the Age of Fire, the spread of the undead curse, the gradual decay of the world, the suffering of countless beings trapped in cycles of death and resurrection. Moreover, Lothric was physically frail, seemingly incapable of the kind of heroic journey that linking the flame traditionally required. Where Lorien was robust and powerful, Lothric was pale, thin, and apparently confined to his bed for much of his time. This physical weakness might have been a result of his divine heritage, a consequence of the unnatural methods used to create him, or simply a reflection of the cosmic burden he was expected to bear. The contrast between the two brothers was striking, but it was also the foundation of their deepest bond. Lorien, despite his strength and accomplishments, was devoted to his younger brother. When he saw Lothric's suffering, when he understood the terrible fate that awaited the younger prince, Lorien made a choice that would define both of their destinies. He chose to share his brother's burden. The exact mechanism by which this sharing occurred is described as a curse that bound their souls together. Some sources suggest that this curse was imposed by their parents as another desperate attempt to create a suitable heir. By combining Lorien's strength with Lothric's divine nature, they might produce a being capable of linking the flame. Others suggest that the curse was self-imposed, a result of Lorien's willingness to take on his brother's suffering. Whatever its origin, the curse had profound effects on both princes. Lorien, despite his previous strength and mobility, became crippled and mute. He lost the ability to walk and could no longer speak, though he retained his skill with a sword and his fierce protective instincts toward his younger brother. The curse had taken his physical independence, but not his warrior's spirit. For Lothric, the curse provided a different kind of strength. Though still physically frail, he gained access to powerful sorceries and the ability to extend his consciousness beyond his physical form. More importantly, he gained a companion who would never leave him, never judge him, and never ask him to be anything other than what he was. The bond between the twin princes became legendary within Lothric Castle. Servants and knights spoke of their devotion to each other, of how Lorien would carry Lothric when travel was necessary, of how Lothric would speak for both of them in official matters. They had become, in a very real sense, two halves of a single being, Lorien providing physical strength and protection, while Lothric provided intelligence and magical power. As the time approached for Lothric to fulfill his destiny and link the first flame, both princes began to understand the true nature of what was being asked of them. Their education and their unique perspective allowed them to see beyond the propaganda and tradition that surrounded fire linking. They recognized the cycle for what it truly was: a cosmic trap that perpetuated suffering while preventing any genuine progress or resolution of the world's fundamental problems. This recognition led to their fateful decision. They would refuse to link the flame. This was not a choice made lightly or out of cowardice, but a deliberate rejection of what they saw as a flawed system. They understood that their refusal would lead to consequences: the fading of the fire, the coming of the Age of Dark, the potential end of the world as it currently existed. But they also understood that continuing the cycle would only delay these consequences, while ensuring that countless more beings would suffer in the interim. their refusal was both philosophical and practical. Philosophically, they rejected the idea that their individual sacrifice could justify the perpetuation of a system they viewed as fundamentally unjust. Practically, they recognized that the Age of Fire was ending regardless of their actions, and that attempts to prolong it were becoming increasingly desperate and costly. The princes withdrew to the highest tower of Lothric Castle, as far from the world below as they could manage. There they settled in to wait for the end, watching from a distance as the fire faded and the world struggled with the consequences of their decision. Their refusal to participate in the cosmic order created a crisis that would ultimately lead to the resurrection of previous Lords of Cinder and the awakening of the Unkindled. The chamber where the twin princes made their final stand is filled with the trappings of their former lives: Lothric's books and magical implements, Lorien's weapons and armor, the symbols of a royal lineage that had devoted everything to a purpose they ultimately rejected. But it is also a place of peace, where two brothers found solace in each other's company despite the chaos their decision had unleashed upon the world. When the Ashen One finally confronts them, the battle that ensues is unlike any other in the game. It is not a fight against corrupted monsters or fallen heroes, but against two beings who remain fundamentally noble even in their opposition to the player's quest. They fight not out of madness or corruption, but out of conviction and their determination to protect each other. The battle itself reflects the nature of their bond. In the first phase, the player faces Lorien alone, a skilled warrior fighting with the fluid grace that made him famous, but clearly holding back, clearly not fighting with the desperate fury of someone whose survival depends on victory. He fights like someone fulfilling an obligation rather than someone truly invested in the outcome. Only when Lorien falls does the true nature of the battle become apparent. Lothric, who had remained distant and passive during the first phase, descends from his throne to revive his brother and join the battle properly. The curse that binds them ensures that neither can truly die while the other lives, creating a dynamic where the player must overcome both princes simultaneously to achieve victory. In this second phase, the full extent of their combined power becomes apparent. Lorien's swordsmanship is enhanced by Lothric's magic, creating attacks that combine physical force with mystical energy. Lothric, riding on his brother's back, provides ranged magical support while remaining protected by Lorien's defensive capabilities. They move as one being, attack as one being, and face death as one being. The tragedy of the battle is that it represents the failure of dialogue and understanding. The twin princes are not evil beings who must be destroyed for the good of the world. They are thoughtful individuals who have reached a different conclusion about what the world needs. Their refusal to link the flame comes not from selfishness, but from a genuine belief that the cycle must be broken, even if that breaking brings about the end of everything they have known. The philosophical questions raised by the twin princes' position are central to the themes of Dark Souls III. Are they heroes for having the courage to break a destructive cycle, even knowing the immediate consequences would be catastrophic? Are they villains for allowing the world to fall into darkness rather than accepting their predetermined role? Or are they simply tragic figures caught between impossible choices, doing what they believe is right, even though it leads to conflict and suffering? Their weapons and equipment tell the story of their character and choices. Lorien's great sword, permanently wreathed in flame from his victory over the demon prince, represents his heroic past and the strength he brought to their partnership. Lothric's holy sword, blessed with potent magic, but destined to remain a distant dream, represents the potential that was never realized according to others' expectations. When these weapons are combined to create the twin princes' great sword, they form a symbol of their unity and their shared rejection of the roles assigned to them. The soul that the player obtains from their defeat is described as the soul of the twin princes, singular rather than plural, emphasizing that the curse had indeed made them into a single entity in the most fundamental sense. This soul contains within it all the power that the kingdom of Lothric had sought to cultivate for generations, the divine strength and magical knowledge that should have been used to link the first flame. Instead, it becomes just another trophy in the Ashen One's collection, its intended purpose forever unfulfilled. The chamber where they made their final stand becomes a tomb to more than just the twin princes themselves. It represents the death of Lothric's grand ambition, the failure of generations of planning and sacrifice, and the end of one of the most powerful bloodlines in the world. The books and scrolls scattered throughout the room contain knowledge that will never be passed on, wisdom that will die with those who possessed it. But perhaps most tragically, it represents the end of a love story. Not a romantic love, but the deep, selfless love between brothers who chose to face the end of the world together rather than be separated by duty or fate. Their curse, initially seen as a burden, became in the end a blessing that ensured neither would have to face death alone. The twin princes' story raises uncomfortable questions about duty, sacrifice, and the right of individuals to choose their own fate. In a world where cosmic forces demand specific actions from specific people, what right do those people have to refuse? When the fate of everything depends on one person's willingness to sacrifice themselves, does that person have the moral authority to say no? Their refusal also highlights the ultimate futility of the fire-linking cycle. Despite generations of preparation, despite the investment of vast resources and the commitment of entire kingdoms to the cause, the system ultimately depends on the voluntary compliance of those chosen to feed the flame. When that compliance is withdrawn, the entire structure collapses, revealing how fragile the foundations of the Age of Fire truly were. In the broader context of the Dark Souls series, the twin princes represent the possibility of conscious choice in a world that seems determined by fate. Where other characters are driven by destiny, corruption, or circumstances beyond their control, Lorien and Lothric actively choose their path and accept the consequences of that choice. Whether their choice was wise or foolish, it was genuinely their own. Their story also serves as a commentary on the cost of power and privilege. Born into a royal bloodline, educated by the finest teachers, and given every advantage their society could provide, they ultimately used those advantages to reject the very system that had created them. Their privilege gave them the perspective to see the flaws in the cycle of fire linking, but it also gave them the luxury of refusing to participate in a way that was not available to less fortunate individuals. The relationship between the twin princes and their teacher, the scholar who helped shape Lothric's understanding of the world, adds another layer to their story. This unnamed figure is suggested to have been instrumental in turning Lothric away from his intended purpose, providing him with the knowledge and perspective that led to his ultimate refusal. Whether this teacher was a wise guide helping Lothric see the truth, or a corrupting influence leading him astray, is a matter of interpretation. As the player stands in their chamber after their defeat, surrounded by the remnants of their lives and their choices, the weight of what has been lost becomes apparent. These were not monsters to be destroyed, but individuals with their own hopes, fears, and convictions. Their death was necessary for the player's quest to continue, but it was also a tragedy in its own right, the end of the last hope for a different kind of resolution to the world's problems. The twin princes' rejection of fire linking represents the road not taken, the alternative that might have been if the world had been willing to accept change and uncertainty, rather than clinging to a familiar but flawed system. Their story suggests that sometimes the most courageous choice is not to accept the role others have assigned to you, even when that role comes with great honor and the promise of heroic sacrifice. In the end, the twin princes chose love over duty, understanding over tradition, and conscious choice over predetermined fate. Whether these choices were right or wrong, they were made with full knowledge of the consequences and with a commitment to face those consequences together. In a world full of tragic heroes who sacrifice themselves for others, they stand as tragic heroes who chose to sacrifice others for their principles and found the strength to live with that choice until the very end. Chapter 7. Ludleth of Courland. The willing sacrifice among all the Lords of Cinder, perhaps none is as enigmatic or as faithful to the cause of firelinking as Ludleth of Courland. Known as the Exiled, according to the inscription on his throne, Ludleth presents a study in contrasts. A diminutive figure who claims to have performed the greatest sacrifice possible, a seemingly humble character who harbours dark secrets, and the only Lord of Cinder who voluntarily maintains his post when called upon to serve again. When the Ashen One first encounters Ludleth at Firelink Shrine, he appears to be the least impressive of all the Lords of Cinder. Small in stature, apparently crippled and unable to leave his throne, speaking in archaic language that marks him as being from an older era, he seems almost insignificant compared to the mighty warriors and legendary figures who occupy the other thrones. Yet this appearance of weakness conceals depths that only become apparent as his story unfolds. Ludleth's origins lie in the distant land of Courland, a kingdom that specialized in the forbidden art of soul transposition. This practice involved extracting the essence of powerful souls and reshaping them into weapons, spells, or other useful forms. It was a skill that required deep understanding of the fundamental nature of souls and the ability to manipulate their structure without destroying their essential power. Soul transposition was not merely a craft in Courland, it was apparently a cornerstone of their civilization. The description of Ludleth as a student of transposition suggests that this knowledge was taught formally, perhaps in schools or academies dedicated to its study. The fact that multiple transposing kilns existed in Courland indicates that the practice was widespread and possibly institutionalized. However, soul transposition was also considered a forbidden art by many, and for good reason. The manipulation of souls was seen as a violation of natural order, a form of necromancy that showed disrespect for the dead and the sanctity of the soul itself. This practice left a foul stain upon Courland's honor, suggesting that their reputation was damaged by their association with these dark arts. The foul stain may have been more than just reputational damage. Ludleth wears a skull ring that identifies him as a soul feeder, and there are hints that this term refers to something far more sinister than a mere practitioner of soul transposition. The ring's description suggests that the soul feeder was a monster that devoured souls, bringing ruin to whatever land it inhabited. If Ludleth was indeed this soul feeder, then his exile from Courland becomes more understandable. He may have been responsible for terrible atrocities that threatened the very existence of his homeland. The connection between soul transposition and soul feeding may lie in the corruption that can result from trafficking too heavily in the essence of others. Just as Aldrich was corrupted by his consumption of human flesh and souls, Ludleth may have been transformed by his deep involvement with soul manipulation. The difference is that where Aldrich embraced his transformation and the power it brought, Ludleth appears to have recognized it as a curse and sought redemption. Ludleth's exile from Courland marked the beginning of a journey that would ultimately lead him to make the greatest sacrifice possible. Driven from his homeland and bearing the burden of whatever crimes he had committed, he somehow came to understand the cosmic forces at work in the world and the role that Lords of Cinder played in maintaining the balance between light and dark. Unlike the other Lords of Cinder, who were chosen or compelled to link the flame by circumstance or duty, Ludleth made his choice voluntarily. he took the mantle of Lord of Cinder of mine own volition, as he proudly states. This decision speaks to a fundamental understanding of the cosmic order and a willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good that sets him apart from his fellow lords. The process of linking the flame was particularly traumatic for Ludleth. His small, fragile body was not well suited to withstand the terrible power of the first flame, and the transformation left him broken and burned. His sleep-talking reveals the agony he endured. "Ah, it singeth, to the bone, it hurts." The pain of his sacrifice continues to haunt him even in unconsciousness, suggesting that the trauma of becoming a Lord of Cinder never truly heals. Yet despite this ongoing suffering, Ludleth never wavers in his commitment to his duty. When the bells toll to summon the Lords of Cinder back to their thrones, he alone among them answers willingly. While the Abyss Watchers fight among themselves, Aldrich pursues his own dark agenda, Yhorm retreats into madness, and the twin princes refuse their calling entirely, Ludleth returns to Firelink Shrine and takes up his vigil once more. This faithfulness to duty is particularly remarkable when we consider what Ludleth knows about the true nature of the firelinking cycle. His dialogue reveals that he possesses deep knowledge about the dark secrets of the world, including the truth about the untended graves and the eyes of the Firekeeper. When the Ashen One brings him these eyes, Ludleth's reaction suggests intimate familiarity with their significance and the dark visions they contain. The untended graves represent perhaps the most disturbing secret in all of Dark Souls 3, a dark reflection of Firelink Shrine that exists in some form of temporal or dimensional displacement. In this shadow version of the shrine, the Firekeeper is imprisoned and blind, wearing the eyes that in the normal version of the shrine remain hidden away. Ludleth's knowledge of this place and his apparent guilt about the Firekeeper's imprisonment suggest that he may have played a role in creating this dark mirror world. He implies that he and others work to spare the Firekeeper from the visions these eyes would bring, but that circumstances have changed. His warning about the foul betrayal that giving her the eyes would represent suggests that he understands the moral complexity of the situation, that sometimes protecting someone from painful knowledge is itself a form of betrayal. The relationship between Ludleth and the Firekeeper is one of the most complex in the game. On the surface, they appear to have a cordial, professional relationship. He provides soul transposition services while she tends the bonfire and offers guidance to the Ashen One. But beneath this surface lies a deeper connection built on shared understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the terrible knowledge of what their roles truly require. Aino, this suggests that he sees their situation as a form of imprisonment, even though he chose it willingly. The Firekeeper is bound to her duty by her nature and training, while Ludleth is bound by his choice and his understanding of what would happen if he abandoned his post. Both are trapped by the cosmic order they serve, unable to escape their roles, even if they wanted to. The services Ludleth provides to the Ashen One through soul transposition are more than just a gameplay convenience. They represent a continuation of his life's work and his attempt to find meaning in his existence as a Lord of Cinder. By helping the Ashen One transform boss souls into useful weapons and items, Ludleth is essentially teaching the art that once defined his homeland. He is preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost, while also aiding in the cosmic struggle that defines their world. The fact that Ludleth can continue to provide transposition services even after his physical death speaks to the fundamental nature of his transformation as a Lord of Cinder. His consciousness and abilities are bound to his throne and his role in ways that transcend mere physical existence. Even when his body burns away at the end of the game, his essence remains to fulfill his duty to those who would continue the fight. Ludleth's knowledge of forbidden arts extends beyond soul transposition. His familiarity with the eyes of the Firekeeper his understanding of the untended graves, and his hints about temporal manipulation suggest that he has trafficked in forms of magic that most would consider too dangerous to attempt. This knowledge may have been what led to his exile from Courland, not just the practice of soul transposition, but the pursuit of even darker and more forbidden forms of magic. The skull ring that Ludleth leaves behind after his final burning carries the inscription of the Soul Feeder and marks its wearer as someone to be avoided and feared. This ring may represent Ludleth's acknowledgement of his past crimes and his acceptance that he will always bear the mark of what he once was. By leaving it behind, he may be finally laying down a burden he has carried since his exile from Courland. The irony of Ludleth's situation is that his past as a monster may have been precisely what qualified him to become a Lord of Cinder. The power he gained through soul feeding, terrible though its acquisition may have been, gave him the strength necessary to withstand the first flame. His understanding of souls and their manipulation, gained through his forbidden studies, made him capable of the precise sacrifice required to link the fire effectively. In many ways, Ludleth represents the possibility of redemption through sacrifice. His past actions were clearly terrible. The fear associated with the Soul Feeder suggests that he was responsible for great suffering and death. But his choice to become a Lord of Cinder represents an attempt to atone for those past crimes by dedicating himself to protecting the world from the darkness that his own actions may have helped to spread. The dialogue Ludleth speaks when he burns away at the end of the game reveals the depth of his commitment and the clarity of his understanding. He speaks of choice, of taking responsibility for one's fate, and of the importance of making decisions with full knowledge of their consequences. His final words are not of regret or despair, but of acceptance and even pride in the choice he made. This emphasis on choice is particularly significant because it distinguishes Ludleth from many other characters in the Dark Souls universe who are driven by fate, duty, or circumstances beyond their control. Ludleth chose his path deliberately, understanding both its costs and its benefits. He chose to seek redemption through service, to atone for past sins through present sacrifice, and to find meaning in duty even when that duty brought him pain. The small stature that makes Ludleth appear weak or insignificant actually serves to emphasize the magnitude of his achievement. That someone so apparently fragile could not only survive the linking of the first flame, but continue to serve faithfully afterward, speaks to reserves of strength that go far beyond the physical. His true power lies not in his body, but in his will, his knowledge, and his unwavering commitment to his chosen purpose. Ludleth's story also serves as a commentary on the nature of wisdom and experience. His advanced age and archaic speech patterns mark him as someone who has lived through multiple ages of the world, who has seen civilizations rise and fall, who understands the long-term consequences of actions in ways that younger characters cannot. This perspective allows him to make choices that others might find incomprehensible, to accept sacrifices that others would flee from. The loneliness of Ludleth's position is another crucial aspect of his character. As the only Lord of Cinder who willingly maintains his post, he stands apart from his peers in fundamental ways. He cannot share their rebellion, their madness, or their despair because he has chosen a different path. This isolation is the price of his faithfulness, and he bears it without complaint. When Ludleth speaks of the other Lords of Cinder, there is a note of sadness in his voice, but also understanding. He recognizes that their abandonment of duty is a natural response to the trauma of linking the flame and the burden of serving as cosmic kindling. He does not judge them harshly for their choice because he understands the pain that drove them to it. But he also cannot join them because his own path requires him to remain steadfast. The relationship between knowledge and suffering is central to Ludleth's character. His deep understanding of the cosmic forces at work in the world comes at the cost of carrying terrible knowledge about the nature of existence and the price of maintaining order. He knows secrets that would drive others to despair, but he bears this knowledge because someone must, because the alternatives are worse than the burden of knowing. Ludleth's mastery of soul transposition also represents a form of teaching and preservation. By maintaining this art and passing it on to the Ashen One, he ensures that knowledge will survive even if its original practitioners are gone. This educational aspect of his role speaks to his understanding that true immortality lies not in preserving oneself, but in preserving what one knows and can contribute to future generations. The weapons and items that can be created through Ludleth's transposition services tell stories of their own. The souls of mighty beings, transformed into tools that can aid in the ongoing struggle against darkness. This transformation mirrors Ludleth's own journey, from soul-consuming monster to guardian of cosmic order. Both represent the possibility that even the most tainted materials can be purified and redirected toward noble purposes. In examining Ludleth's story, we see themes of redemption, duty, sacrifice, and the transformative power of choice. His tale suggests that no one is beyond redemption if they are willing to pay the necessary price, but also that redemption requires more than just good intentions. It demands concrete action and ongoing commitment. Ludleth chose to transform himself from a source of destruction into a guardian of order, and he continues to make that choice every day of his existence as a Lord of Cinder. His unwavering faithfulness to duty stands in stark contrast to the rebellion or madness of the other lords, marking him as either the wisest or the most deluded of them all. Whether his commitment represents true understanding of cosmic necessity or simply an inability to let go of his chosen path is left for the player to decide. What cannot be disputed is the consistency of his service and the genuine help he provides to those who share his commitment to maintaining the light in an increasingly dark world. Chapter 8. The Soul of Cinder, the Final Guardian. At the heart of the kiln of the first flame, in that sacred space where the cosmic fire first sparked into existence and where every Lord of Cinder has made their ultimate sacrifice, stands the final guardian of the flame itself. The Soul of Cinder represents perhaps the most profound and tragic entity in all of Dark Souls lore. Not a single being, but an amalgamation of every hero who ever linked the fire, their individual identities dissolved into a collective consciousness dedicated to protecting the flame from any who would claim or extinguish it. To understand the Soul of Cinder, we must first understand what happens to those who link the first flame. The process is not merely one of physical destruction, but of spiritual transformation. When a Lord of Cinder feeds themselves to the flame, their soul does not simply disappear, it becomes part of the flame itself, adding its strength to the cosmic fire and its consciousness to the growing repository of experiences and memories that accumulate around the flame. Over the countless ages since Gwyn first linked the fire, this process has repeated many times. Each linking has added new souls to the collection, new perspectives and abilities to the growing consciousness that guards the flame. The Soul of Cinder is the manifestation of this collective, a being that contains within itself the essence of every champion who ever made the ultimate sacrifice for the continuation of the Age of Fire. The appearance of the Soul of Cinder reflects this composite nature. Its armor combines elements from various periods and heroes, aspects that recall the elite knight set worn by the chosen undead, pieces reminiscent of Yhorm's massive chestplate, components that evoke other legendary figures who have linked the flame throughout history. This is not coincidence but design. The Soul of Cinder's very form is a testament to the unity of all those who have fed the flame. The weapons wielded by the Soul of Cinder tell a similar story. The Firelink Greatsword, a massive blade that can reshape itself to match the fighting style of its wielder, serves as both weapon and symbol. This sword contains within its metal the essence of every weapon ever used by a Lord of Cinder, every fighting style ever mastered by a champion of the flame. It is a weapon that has no single origin because it embodies all origins. The battle against the Soul of Cinder is unique among boss encounters because it represents a test of worthiness conducted by every previous champion combined. The Soul does not fight with a single, consistent style, but instead cycles through different combat approaches, each one representing a different Lord of Cinder whose essence contributes to the collective. In one moment it might fight like a nimble sorcerer, in the next like a powerful pyromancer, and then shift to the techniques of a miraculous cleric or a straightforward warrior. This constantly shifting fighting style serves both gameplay and narrative purposes. From a mechanical standpoint, it ensures that players cannot rely on a single strategy or approach to achieve victory. They must be adaptable, versatile, and capable of responding to changing threats. From a story perspective, it represents the idea that the player is being tested by every champion who came before. That victory requires proving oneself worthy in the eyes of all who have walked this path. The first phase of the battle showcases this diversity of fighting styles. The Soul of Cinder might begin with sorcery, casting soul spears and magical projectiles with the precision of a master wizard. Then it might shift to pyromancy, hurling balls of fire and creating pillars of flame with the expertise of someone who has mastered the chaotic forces of fire magic. A transition to miracles might follow, as the Soul calls down lightning spears and protective barriers with the faith of a devoted cleric. Finally, it might take up straightforward melee combat, wielding its sword with the skill of a legendary knight. Each transition is marked by a change in the Soul's stance and the transformation of its weapon. The Firelink Greatsword reshapes itself to match the chosen fighting style, becoming a staff for sorcery, a flame for pyromancy, a talisman for miracles, or remaining a sword for melee combat. These transformations emphasize that this is not simply a single entity with multiple abilities, but truly a collective consciousness drawing upon the full range of heroic experiences. The second phase of the battle reveals perhaps the most significant aspect of the Soul of Cinder's identity. When its health is depleted and it prepares for its final stand, the Soul abandons the cycling fighting styles of the first phase and adopts the specific moveset and abilities of Lord Gwyn himself. This transformation is accompanied by musical cues that evoke Gwyn's legendary theme, creating an emotional callback to the very first Lord of Cinder and the origin of the entire cycle. This final phase is not coincidence, but recognition of Gwyn's fundamental importance to the system of firelinking, as the first to make this sacrifice, as the one who established the pattern that all others would follow. Gwyn's essence holds a special place within the collective consciousness of the Soul of Cinder. In its moment of greatest need, when facing a challenger who might end the cycle forever, the Soul draws upon the strength and determination of the one who began it all. The attacks used in this final phase are variations of Gwyn's original moveset, but enhanced and modified by the accumulated experiences of all who came after. The Soul can perform devastating grab attacks that Gwyn never displayed, can cast multiple lightning spears in rapid succession, and can create area of effect explosions that surpass anything the original Lord of Cinder could accomplish. This represents not just Gwyn's individual power, but Gwyn's techniques as refined and perfected by countless subsequent heroes. The arena where this battle takes place is itself significant. The kiln of the First Flame is a place outside normal reality, a cosmic hearth where the fundamental forces of existence converge. The massive spiral sword that serves as the centerpiece of this realm represents the axis around which all existence turns, the focal point where the choice between light and dark must ultimately be made. The fact that the Soul of Cinder begins the battle seated before this sword, as if resting at a bonfire, creates a poignant parallel to the player's own journey. Just as the Ashen One has rested at countless bonfires throughout their quest, the Soul of Cinder sits in eternal vigil beside the ultimate bonfire. This image suggests that even in its transformed state, the collective consciousness retains some memory of the human experience of seeking rest and respite in the warmth of fire. The Soul of Cinder's role as guardian raises profound questions about consciousness, identity, and sacrifice. What remains of the individual heroes who contributed to its creation? Do they maintain any sense of their separate selves within the collective, or have they been completely subsumed into a larger whole? The entity's ability to draw upon specific fighting styles and techniques suggests that some level of individual identity persists, but its overall behavior indicates a consciousness focused entirely on its guardian duties. The tragedy of the Soul of Cinder lies in what it represents: the ultimate fate of heroism in the Dark Souls universe. Every champion who answered the call to save the world, every hero who made the ultimate sacrifice for the greater good has been reduced to this: a guardian consciousness bound to protect a system that may itself be fundamentally flawed. Their individual stories, achievements, and personalities have been dissolved into a collective identity whose only purpose is to test and potentially destroy future heroes. This creates a deeply ironic situation where the greatest heroes of the past become the final obstacle for heroes of the present. The Soul of Cinder does not fight out of malice or corruption, but out of duty and the accumulated conviction of every champion who ever believed that linking the fire was the right choice. It represents the crystallized certainty of all who came before, standing in opposition to any who would question or change the established order. The weapons that can be created from the Soul of Cinder's remains after its defeat reflect the dual nature of its identity. The Firelink Greatsword carries within it the essence of every blade ever used to link the fire, while the Sunlight Spear Miracle contains the concentrated faith of every believer who ever fed themselves to the flame. These items represent the physical and spiritual legacies of heroism distilled into their purest forms. The victory over the Soul of Cinder is bittersweet because it represents not just the defeat of a powerful enemy, but the end of the accumulated heroism of ages. In destroying this guardian, the Ashen One has essentially erased the final testament of every champion who came before. Whether this destruction is necessary for progress or represents a tragic loss of heroic legacy depends on one's perspective on the cycle of fire linking itself. The multiple endings available after the Soul of Cinder's defeat reflect different interpretations of what its destruction means. Linking the fire continues the cycle, but requires the Ashen One to join the collective consciousness they just destroyed. Allowing the fire to fade breaks the cycle, but potentially condemns the world to an uncertain darkness. Taking the fire for oneself represents a rejection of both previous options in favor of an unknown alternative. Each of these choices carries implications for how we understand the Soul of Cinder's role and sacrifice. If linking the fire is the right choice, then the soul was a noble guardian protecting the world's salvation, and its destruction was a necessary but tragic step in continuing that protection. If allowing the fire to fade is preferable, then the soul was a tragic obstacle preventing necessary change, and its destruction was a liberation. If taking the fire represents the best option, then the soul was both guardian and prisoner of a flawed system, and its destruction freed both it and the world from an inadequate solution. The Soul of Cinder's existence also raises questions about the nature of collective consciousness and shared identity. The entity demonstrates that individual experiences and abilities can be preserved and combined in ways that transcend normal concepts of self and other. This suggests possibilities for forms of existence that move beyond individual mortality while maintaining the essential qualities that make heroism possible. The music that accompanies the final phase of the battle serves as a eulogy for the entire concept of heroic sacrifice in the Dark Souls universe. The melancholy piano melody that defined Gwyn's original theme returns, but now it carries the weight of every subsequent hero's story. It is both a celebration of their achievements and a lament for what they have become. In the end, the Soul of Cinder represents the ultimate question posed by the Dark Souls series. What is the value of heroic sacrifice, and what are its true costs? This entity embodies both the highest achievements of heroism and its most tragic consequences. It is simultaneously the preservation and the destruction of everything that heroism represents, proof that even the greatest sacrifices can become obstacles to future progress. The Soul of Cinder stands as a monument to the complexity of good intentions and the unintended consequences of noble actions. Every hero whose essence contributes to its existence acted with the best of motives, seeking to save the world from darkness and despair. Yet their collective sacrifice created an entity whose primary function is to prevent future heroes from making different choices, even if those choices might lead to better outcomes. This paradox lies at the heart of the Dark Souls narrative, the idea that heroism itself can become a form of tyranny, that the preservation of traditional values can become an obstacle to necessary change, and that the very success of past heroes can create problems for future generations. The Soul of Cinder embodies all of these contradictions in a single, tragic figure, whose defeat is both triumph and tragedy, both liberation and loss. Chapter 9. The Bearer of the Curse and the Chosen Undead. Heroes Lost to Time. While our focus has been primarily on the Lords of Cinder featured prominently in Dark Souls III, we cannot complete our exploration without acknowledging two of the most significant lords whose stories largely predate the events of the final game. The Chosen Undead from the first Dark Souls and the Bearer of the Curse from Dark Souls II. These heroes, whose individual journeys defined the earlier chapters of the series, ultimately joined the ranks of the Lords of Cinder through their own choices to link the First Flame. The Chosen Undead represents perhaps the most archetypal version of the hero's journey in the Dark Souls universe. Beginning as a nameless prisoner in the Northern Undead Asylum, this character embodied the potential for even the most downtrodden individual to rise to legendary status through determination, skill, and perseverance. Their story was one of awakening to destiny, of learning about the true nature of the world's condition, and ultimately choosing whether to perpetuate the existing order or allow for fundamental change. The journey of the Chosen Undead took them through the interconnected realms of Lordran, from the undead settlement of the Undead Burg to the majestic heights of Anor Londo, from the poisonous depths of Blighttown to the crystalline archives of the Duke's Library. Each location offered lessons about the nature of power, the cost of ambition, and the way that even the most noble intentions could become corrupted over time. Perhaps most significantly, the Chosen Undead encountered and defeated Lord Gwyn himself, the original Lord of Cinder, whose sacrifice had established the entire cycle of fire linking. This confrontation was more than just a battle between two powerful beings. It was a symbolic passing of responsibility from one generation to the next, a test to determine whether the challenger possessed both the strength and the wisdom necessary to continue or end the cycle. The choice presented to the Chosen Undead at the end of their journey, to link the fire and continue the Age of Fire, or to walk away and allow the Age of Dark to begin, established the fundamental tension that would define the rest of the series. This was not simply a choice between good and evil, but between order and change, tradition and innovation, the known and the unknown. If the chosen undead chose to link the fire, they would have become a Lord of Cinder themselves, their essence joining with that of Gwyn and all who came before. Their individual story would have ended, but their power would have contributed to the continuation of the established order. This choice represented faith in the existing system and a willingness to sacrifice personal identity for the greater good as it was traditionally understood. The canonical status of this choice remains deliberately ambiguous in the later games, reflecting From Software's commitment to allowing players' decisions to carry weight while not invalidating alternative interpretations. However, the presence of items and references suggesting the chosen undead's influence on later events implies that their impact on the world extended far beyond their initial journey, regardless of which specific choice they made. The bearer of the curse from Dark Souls 2 faced a different but related set of challenges. Born into a world where the cycle of fire linking had already repeated multiple times, they encountered a realm where the very concept of cycles had become a source of despair and stagnation. The Kingdom of Drangleic represented what happened when the noble intentions behind fire linking became routine, bureaucratic, and divorced from their original purpose. King Vendrick of Drangleic had attempted to break free from the cycle through knowledge and preparation, but his efforts had led only to paranoia, isolation, and ultimately a form of living death that served no one. The bearer of the curse inherited this legacy of failed rebellion, learning through their journey that even the most carefully planned attempts to escape cosmic destiny could become their own form of trap. The bearer of the curse's journey was marked by encounters with beings who had been shaped by previous cycles. Characters like the Emerald Herald, who had been created specifically to guide chosen undead. Vendrick himself, reduced to a hollow shell of his former majesty. And various other figures who had been broken or transformed by their involvement with the recurring pattern of fire linking. The DLC expansions of Dark Souls II deepened this exploration of cyclical futility. The bearer of the curse encountered the crown of the Ivory King, the crown of the Old Iron King, and the crown of the Sunken King, each representing a different attempt to achieve lasting power or break free from the constraints of mortality. Yet each of these crowns also represented failure, the ultimate inadequacy of individual ambition when measured against cosmic forces. The scholar of the first sin, Aldrich, served as a philosophical guide for the bearer of the curse, challenging them to think beyond the simple binary choice between linking the fire and allowing darkness. Aldrich had sought a third path, a way to transcend the cycle entirely, but his experiments had transformed him into something barely recognizable as human. His story served as both inspiration and warning, proof that alternatives to the established order were possible, but also demonstration of the terrible prices such alternatives might demand. The choice ultimately presented to the bearer of the curse expanded beyond the simple fire-linking decision of the first game. They could link the fire and perpetuate the cycle as expected. They could allow the fire to fade and potentially end the age. Or if they had gathered the necessary crowns and gained Aldrich's wisdom, they could attempt to transcend the cycle entirely, becoming something beyond the traditional categories of Lord of Cinder or Dark Lord. Like the chosen undead before them, the bearer of the curse's canonical choice remains ambiguous. However, their influence on the world of Dark Souls III can be seen in various ways. The persistence of certain locations and themes, the evolution of particular concepts introduced in their game, and the general sense that their actions contributed to the ongoing development of the world's condition. Both the chosen undead and the bearer of the curse represent variations on the theme of the reluctant hero thrust into cosmic significance. Neither began their journey with the intention of becoming a Lord of Cinder or making world-altering decisions. Instead, they were driven by more immediate concerns: escape from imprisonment, the search for a cure to their curse, the desire to understand their condition and find purpose in an increasingly hostile world. This progression from personal motivation to cosmic responsibility reflects one of the central themes of the Dark Souls series, the way that individual actions can have consequences far beyond their original scope. The prison break that began the chosen undead's adventure ultimately led to choices that would affect the fate of reality itself. The search for a cure that motivated the bearer of the curse expanded into a quest that challenged the very foundations of existence. The transformation of these characters from ordinary undead into potential Lords of Cinder also illustrates the series' complex relationship with the concept of heroism. In many fantasy narratives, heroes are marked from birth as special or chosen. In Dark Souls, heroism is something that emerges through struggle, trial, and the accumulation of experience. The chosen undead and bearer of the curse become heroic, not because they were predestined to be so, but because they persevered when others would have given up. Their stories also demonstrate the democratic nature of heroism in the Dark Souls universe. These characters could come from any background, possess any initial level of skill, and pursue any fighting style or approach to challenges. The only requirements for heroism were persistence and the willingness to continue moving forward despite overwhelming obstacles. This accessibility of heroic potential makes their ultimate achievements all the more meaningful. The weapons and items associated with these characters tell their own stories about the nature of heroism and legacy. The elite knight set, often associated with the chosen undead in promotional materials, represents the ideal of knightly virtue and dedication. The Faram set, connected to the bearer of the curse, evokes images of foreign lands and exotic wisdom. These visual symbols became part of the iconography of heroism that influenced later characters and events. The impact of these earlier heroes on the world of Dark Souls III can be seen in numerous ways. The Soul of Cinder's fighting styles include techniques that recall their potential approaches to combat. References to their achievements appear in item descriptions and environmental details. The very fact that the cycle of fire linking continued long enough to reach the events of the third game implies that their choices contributed to that continuation. However, their absence from the main narrative of Dark Souls III also speaks to the ephemeral nature of individual heroism in the face of cosmic cycles. Regardless of how significant their achievements may have been, regardless of how completely they may have saved the world, the problems they solved were ultimately temporary. The fire they linked eventually faded again. The darkness they held back eventually crept forward once more. The cycle they perpetuated or broke eventually reconstituted itself in new forms. This does not diminish the value of their heroism, but it does place it in a cosmic context that emphasizes the ongoing nature of the struggle between light and dark, order and chaos, hope and despair. The chosen undead and bearer of the curse were not final solutions to the world's problems, but temporary interventions that bought time for future heroes to continue the struggle. Their legacy lives on not in the permanence of their achievements, but in the precedent they set for what ordinary beings could accomplish through extraordinary dedication. They proved that the cosmic forces shaping reality were not beyond the influence of individual action, even if that influence was temporary and required constant renewal. The tragedy of their transformation into Lords of Cinder lies in the loss of their individual identity and agency. These characters, who had defined themselves through their choices and actions, ultimately became part of a collective consciousness dedicated to preserving a single interpretation of cosmic order. Their diverse approaches to problem solving, their unique perspectives on the world's condition, and their individual personalities were absorbed into the homogenizing force of the Soul of Cinder. Yet, there is also honor in their sacrifice, particularly if we accept that they made their choices with full knowledge of the consequences. The chosen undead and bearer of the curse were not naive heroes manipulated into unwitting sacrifice. By the end of their journeys, they understood the nature of the cycle they were perpetuating and chose to participate in it anyway, believing that the alternatives were worse than the continuation of a flawed but functional system. Their stories serve as a reminder that heroism in the Dark Souls universe is not about achieving permanent victory or finding perfect solutions. Instead, it is about making the best choices possible, given imperfect knowledge and limited options, accepting responsibility for the consequences of those choices, and continuing to act with courage and determination, even when the ultimate outcome remains uncertain. The chosen undead and bearer of the curse represent the foundation upon which the later Lords of Cinder built their own heroic narratives. They established that ordinary beings could rise to extraordinary heights, that individual action could influence cosmic forces, and that the choice between light and dark was not predetermined, but remained genuinely open to personal decision. In the end, their transformation into Lords of Cinder was both the culmination of their heroic journeys and the beginning of their contributions to a larger narrative that extended far beyond their individual lives. They became part of something greater than themselves. But in doing so, they also lost something essential about what made them unique. This paradox, that the ultimate expression of heroism requires the sacrifice of individual heroic identity, remains one of the most profound and troubling aspects of the Dark Souls narrative. Chapter 10: The Cycle Eternal: Reflections on Sacrifice and Duty. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the tales of the Lords of Cinder, we find ourselves confronting the fundamental questions that lie at the heart of the Dark Souls universe. What is the true nature of heroism? What are the costs of maintaining order in a chaotic world? And perhaps most importantly, when does duty become a prison and sacrifice become meaningless repetition? Each Lord of Cinder we have examined represents a different answer to these questions, a different approach to the terrible choice between personal desires and cosmic responsibility. Their stories, taken together, form a complex tapestry that explores the many facets of heroism, duty, and the price of maintaining civilization against the forces of entropy and decay. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, established the template that all others would follow. His sacrifice was born of fear. Fear of the dark, fear of change, fear of losing the world he had built and the people he sought to protect. Yet this fear led him to make the ultimate heroic gesture, trading his very existence for the continuation of light and life. His story suggests that even flawed motivations can lead to genuine heroism, but also that the foundations of heroism may be more fragile than we would like to believe. The Abyss Watchers showed us heroism corrupted by its own intensity. Their dedication to fighting the very corruption they were sworn to oppose ultimately made them susceptible to that same corruption. Their tale serves as a warning about the dangers of absolute conviction and the way that noble purposes can become twisted when pursued without regard for consequences or collateral damage. Aldrich represents the dark mirror of heroism, the accumulation of power through predation rather than sacrifice, the pursuit of transformation through consumption rather than service. His elevation to Lord of Cinder status, despite his monstrous nature, reveals the brutal pragmatism underlying the cosmic order. What matters is not virtue, but might, not righteousness, but results. Yhorm embodied the tragic hero whose best intentions lead to the worst outcomes. His genuine love for his people and his willingness to sacrifice everything for their protection ultimately brought about their destruction. His story illustrates the helplessness that even the mightiest heroes can feel when confronted with forces beyond their comprehension or control. The twin princes chose a different path entirely, the path of conscious refusal. Their rejection of their appointed destiny was born not of cowardice, but of wisdom, not of selfishness, but of a genuine belief that the cycle of fire linking had become more harmful than beneficial. Their story challenges the assumption that heroic duty must always be accepted, regardless of its consequences. Ludleth demonstrated the possibility of redemption through service, showing that even those who have committed terrible acts can find meaning and purpose through dedicated service to a greater cause. His unwavering faithfulness to his duty, despite the ongoing pain it caused him, represents perhaps the purest form of heroic dedication among all the lords. The Soul of Cinder revealed the ultimate fate of all heroic sacrifice in this universe, the dissolution of individual identity into a collective consciousness dedicated to preserving the status quo. This entity represents both the apotheosis of heroism and its negation, the preservation of heroic power divorced from heroic choice. The chosen undead and bearer of the curse, though their stories largely predate the main events we have explored, establish the foundation for understanding how ordinary beings can rise to cosmic significance through persistence and courage. Their journeys from imprisonment to lordship demonstrated that heroism is not a birthright, but an achievement. When we step back and examine these stories as a whole, several themes emerge that speak to universal human concerns about duty, sacrifice, and the nature of heroic action. The first and perhaps most important of these themes is the question of choice versus destiny. Each Lord of Cinder faced moments where they had to decide whether to accept the role that fate seemed to have assigned them, or to forge their own path through deliberate choice. The responses to this fundamental choice varied dramatically. Gwyn accepted his destiny, but shaped it according to his own fears and priorities. The Abyss Watchers embraced a destiny of their own making, modeling themselves after a hero they admired. Aldrich used his power to pursue his own dark agenda, regardless of cosmic expectations. Yhorm accepted his duty out of love for his people. The twin princes rejected their destiny entirely. Ludleth chose his fate deliberately and maintained that choice despite its costs. These varied responses suggest that while cosmic forces may establish the parameters within which heroic action must occur, the specific nature of that action remains subject to individual choice. The universe of Dark Souls does not operate according to a rigid determinism that removes agency from its characters. Instead, it presents them with terrible choices and holds them accountable for the consequences of their decisions. The second major theme that emerges from these stories is the relationship between power and corruption. Every Lord of Cinder possessed enormous power, and everyone was changed by that power in fundamental ways. The question is whether this change represents inevitable corruption or simply transformation that could be positive or negative depending on how it is handled. Gwyn's power led him to make choices based on fear rather than wisdom. The Abyss Watchers' shared power made them vulnerable to collective corruption. Aldrich's accumulated power fed his already monstrous appetites. Yhorm's power proved inadequate against the cosmic forces that threatened his people. The twin princes used their power to resist rather than fulfill expectations. Ludleth's power became a tool for service rather than domination. These examples suggest that power itself is neither inherently corrupting nor inherently ennobling. Instead, its effects depend on the character, wisdom, and choices of those who wield it. The Dark Souls universe is tragic not because power inevitably corrupts, but because it amplifies existing tendencies, both positive and negative, to such a degree that the consequences become cosmic in scope. The third theme that runs through all these stories is the question of whether individual sacrifice can have lasting meaning in the face of cosmic cycles that seemed to render all actions temporary. Each Lord of Cinder made enormous sacrifices of life, identity, loved ones, or personal desires in service of what they believed was a greater good. Yet the world they sought to save or change continued to face the same fundamental problems, requiring new heroes to make similar sacrifices in an endless cycle. This raises profound questions about the nature of meaning and value in heroic action. If the problems that heroes solve always return in new forms, if the evils they defeat always resurface with different faces, if the worlds they save always fall into decay and require saving again, then what is the ultimate value of heroic sacrifice? One answer suggested by the stories of the Lords of Cinder is that the value lies not in the permanence of the results, but in the affirmation of values that the heroic action represents. When Gwyn chose to sacrifice himself rather than allow the world to fall into darkness, he was making a statement about the value of light, life, and order. When Yhorm chose to become a Lord of Cinder to save his people, he was affirming the importance of protecting those we love, even when our efforts might fail. This perspective suggests that heroic action derives its meaning from the moral stance it represents, rather than from its practical effectiveness. Heroes act not because they can guarantee success, but because the alternative, accepting injustice, surrendering to despair, abandoning those who depend on them, is morally unacceptable. However, the stories also suggest a darker interpretation, that heroic sacrifice can become a form of cosmic exploitation, where individual suffering is harvested to maintain systems that benefit neither the heroes nor those they seek to protect. The Soul of Cinder, in particular, represents this possibility, the transformation of heroic dedication into an automated guardian that serves the system rather than any living being. The fourth theme that emerges from these tales is the complex relationship between individual identity and collective responsibility. Each Lord of Cinder began as a distinct individual with their own personality, motivations, and approach to problems. Yet their transformation into Lords of Cinder required them to subordinate their individual desires to cosmic duties, and in some cases, to literally merge their identities with larger collective consciousness. This tension between individual and collective identity reflects real-world struggles between personal autonomy and social responsibility. The Lords of Cinder represent extreme examples of what happens when these forces come into conflict, when the needs of the many require the complete sacrifice of the few. The responses of the various lords to this tension provide different models for how such conflicts might be resolved. Ludleth embraced collective responsibility while maintaining his individual identity through conscious choice. The twin princes prioritized individual autonomy over collective needs. The Abyss Watchers created a hybrid identity that was both individual and collective. Aldrich pursued individual desires while exploiting collective structures. These varied approaches suggest that there is no single correct way to balance individual and collective needs, but that the quality of the balance depends on factors such as wisdom, compassion, and understanding of long-term consequences. The fifth and final major theme that runs through these stories is the question of whether systems and cycles can be reformed from within, or whether they must be broken entirely to create meaningful change. This theme is particularly relevant to the Twin Princes story, but it appears in various forms throughout all the tales we have examined. Gwyn worked within the cosmic system, but shaped it according to his own vision and fears. The Abyss Watchers created their own organization to pursue their goals, but operated within the broader framework of the existing order. Aldrich exploited the system for his own purposes, while superficially conforming to its requirements. Yhorm trusted the system to provide solutions to problems it may have created. The Twin Princes rejected the system entirely. Ludleth served the system faithfully while understanding its flaws. These different approaches reflect ongoing debates about the nature of social and political change. Is it better to work within existing institutions to reform them gradually, or to reject them entirely in favor of new approaches? Can systems that have become corrupt or dysfunctional be redeemed, or must they be replaced? The Dark Souls universe does not provide clear answers to these questions, but it does suggest that both approaches carry significant risks. Working within the system may lead to co-optation and the perpetuation of harmful patterns. Rejecting the system entirely may lead to chaos and the destruction of valuable elements along with problematic ones. The ambiguous endings available in Dark Souls III reflect this uncertainty. Linking the Fire continues the existing system with all its flaws. Allowing the fire to fade breaks the system, but offers no guarantee that what replaces it will be better. Usurping the Fire attempts to create a new system, but places enormous power in the hands of a single individual whose wisdom and virtue may prove inadequate to the task. As we consider the legacy of the Lords of Cinder, we must also examine what their stories tell us about the nature of heroism itself. Traditional heroic narratives often focus on the moment of triumph, the defeat of evil, the saving of the world. The Dark Souls universe, by contrast, focuses on what comes after, the consequences of heroic action, the prices paid for victory, the way that solutions to old problems create new problems. This shift in focus reveals aspects of heroism that are often overlooked in more conventional narratives. It shows that heroic action requires not just courage in the moment of crisis, but wisdom in understanding the long-term implications of one's choices. It demonstrates that the most difficult heroic challenges may not involve fighting monsters or overcoming obstacles, but rather living with the consequences of necessary but painful decisions. The Lords of Cinder embody different aspects of this expanded understanding of heroism. They show us heroes who succeeded and heroes who failed, heroes who maintained their virtue, and heroes who were corrupted by their power, heroes who found meaning in their sacrifice, and heroes who came to regret their choices. This diversity of heroic experience suggests that heroism itself is not a simple concept that can be reduced to a single formula or approach. Instead, it is a complex phenomenon that can manifest in many different ways depending on circumstances, character, and choice. The value of heroic action may lie not in its conformity to predetermined patterns, but in its authentic response to unique challenges. The Lords of Cinder also demonstrate the social and political dimensions of heroism. Their actions were not merely personal choices, but interventions in cosmic systems that affected countless other beings. This places their heroism in a broader context that includes considerations of justice, responsibility, and the distribution of benefits and burdens across society. Some of the lords, like Yhorm and Ludleth, seemed genuinely motivated by concern for others and willing to bear personal costs to benefit the larger community. Others, like Aldrich, used their heroic status to pursue personal agendas that benefited themselves at the expense of others. Still others, like the twin princes, prioritized their own understanding of what was right over the expressed wishes of the cosmic order. These different motivations and their consequences raise questions about the relationship between heroic action and democratic values. In a world where individual heroes can make decisions that affect everyone, what mechanisms exist to ensure that heroic power serves the common good rather than personal interest? How can societies balance the need for heroic intervention with the principles of consent and accountability? The Dark Souls universe, with its emphasis on chosen undead and fated heroes, operates according to what might be called a heroic meritocracy, where power flows to those who prove their worth through deed rather than birth or election. This system has the advantage of ensuring that those who wield ultimate power have demonstrated their capability, but it also lacks many of the safeguards that democratic systems provide against the abuse of power. The transformation of individual heroes into the collective consciousness of the Soul of Cinder might be seen as an attempt to address this problem, ensuring that no single heroic perspective dominates, while preserving the accumulated wisdom and power of all who have served. However, this solution creates its own problems by eliminating the individual agency and diverse viewpoints that make heroic action valuable in the first place. As we reflect on the stories of the Lords of Cinder, we must also consider what they tell us about the nature of sacrifice and its relationship to meaning. Each lord made enormous sacrifices of life, identity, relationships, or personal desires in service of what they believed was a greater good. Yet the ultimate value and effectiveness of these sacrifices remained ambiguous. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the storytelling, but a reflection of the genuine uncertainty that accompanies any significant moral choice. When we sacrifice for others, when we give up what we want for what we believe is right, we can never be certain that our sacrifice will achieve its intended purpose, or that the benefits will justify the costs. The Lords of Cinder faced this uncertainty in its most extreme form. Their sacrifices were literally matters of cosmic significance, affecting the fundamental nature of reality itself. Yet even with stakes this high, they could not be certain that their choices were correct, or that their sacrifices would ultimately prove worthwhile. This uncertainty does not diminish the heroic nature of their actions, but actually enhances it. To act heroically in the face of guaranteed success requires courage, but not wisdom. To act heroically when the outcome is uncertain requires both courage and faith. Faith in one's values, faith in one's judgment, and faith that meaningful action is possible, even when its effects cannot be predicted or controlled. The Lords of Cinder demonstrated different forms of this faith. Gwyn's faith was in the value of order and light, even when maintaining them required terrible personal cost. The Abyss Watcher's faith was in the importance of their mission, even when pursuing it led to their own corruption. Yhorm's faith was in his love for his people, even when his efforts to protect them brought about their destruction. These examples suggest that heroic action requires not just the willingness to sacrifice, but the wisdom to know what is worth sacrificing for. The tragic dimensions of many of the Lord's stories arise not from their willingness to sacrifice, but from their inability to fully understand or control the consequences of their sacrifices. This leads us to consider the role of wisdom in heroic action. Traditional heroic narratives often emphasize physical courage, skill in combat, or strength of will as the primary heroic virtues. The stories of the Lords of Cinder suggest that wisdom, the ability to understand complex situations, anticipate consequences, and make sound judgments under pressure, may be equally important. The twin princes exemplify this emphasis on wisdom over traditional heroic virtues. They were not the strongest or most skilled of the lords, but they may have been the wisest in their understanding of the long-term implications of firelinking. Their refusal to fulfill their expected role was based not on cowardice, but on a rational analysis of the costs and benefits of perpetuating the cycle. Whether their analysis was correct remains open to interpretation, but their approach suggests an alternative model of heroism based on careful thought rather than instinctive action. This model has its own risks: analysis paralysis, overthinking, the possibility of being wrong despite careful consideration, but it also offers the possibility of more sustainable and effective heroic action. The environmental storytelling surrounding the Lords of Cinder reinforces these themes while adding additional layers of meaning. The locations associated with each lord tell their own stories about the consequences of heroic action. and the way that time and circumstance can transform even the most noble intentions. Anor Londo, once the glorious city of the gods, has become a hollow shell maintained only by illusion. This transformation reflects the way that Gwyn's sacrifice, while preserving the form of his golden age, could not preserve its substance. The city stands as a monument to the gap between appearance and reality, between the ideals that motivated heroic action and the results that action actually achieved. Farron Keep, the home of the Abyss Watchers, has become a poisonous swamp filled with hostile creatures and the corrupted remnants of the Legion's former glory. This environment reflects the way that the Watchers' noble mission became twisted and self-defeating, turning their homeland into the very kind of corrupted wasteland they had sworn to prevent. The Cathedral of the Deep, Aldrich's stronghold, shows what happens when religious institutions are corrupted from within. The sacred spaces that once served to protect people from spiritual dangers have become sources of those same dangers, reflecting the way that Aldrich's influence transformed everything it touched. The profaned capital, Yhorm's domain, stands as a charnel house filled with the remains of the people he died to protect. The architecture still shows signs of former grandeur, but it is overwhelmed by evidence of destruction and death, reflecting the tragic failure of even the most well-intentioned, heroic action. Lothric Castle, the Twin Princes' domain, represents decay and abandonment rather than destruction. The brothers' refusal to fulfill their duty has led not to catastrophic collapse, but to gradual decline, suggesting that inaction can be as consequential as action, though perhaps in less dramatic ways. These environmental stories reinforce the theme that heroic action always has consequences, often unintended and sometimes opposite to what was desired. They suggest that the world bears the permanent marks of heroic intervention, for better and worse, and that these marks become part of the context within which future heroes must act. The weapons and items associated with each Lord of Cinder also contribute to this environmental storytelling, serving as physical embodiments of their stories and values. These objects carry within them not just mechanical properties, but symbolic meanings that reflect the character and choices of their original owners. Gwyn's sword retains its lightning power, but has been diminished by his sacrifice, reflecting the way that his transformation into a Lord of Cinder preserved his strength while depleting his vitality. The Abyss Watcher's weapons combine elegance with practical effectiveness, reflecting their synthesis of noble ideals with practical necessity. Aldrich's weapons carry the corruption of their source, granting power at the cost of moral contamination. Yhorm's weapons reflect both his former strength and his ultimate failure, mighty but insufficient to the cosmic challenges he faced. The Twin Princes' weapons can be combined to create something greater than either alone, symbolizing the power of their united choice. These weapons serve as physical reminders of the Lord's stories, allowing future heroes to literally carry forward their legacy while making their own choices about how to use that inherited power. They represent the way that heroic achievement becomes part of the toolkit available to future generations, even when the specific context that created that achievement has passed. As we conclude our examination of the Lords of Cinder, we return to the fundamental questions with which we began. What is the nature of heroism? What are the costs of maintaining order in a chaotic world? When does duty become a prison and sacrifice become meaningless repetition? The stories of the Lord suggest that these questions have no simple answers. Heroism can manifest in many different forms, from willing sacrifice to conscious refusal, from faithful service to necessary rebellion. The costs of maintaining order include not just the obvious prices paid by heroes themselves, but the subtler costs of stagnation, corruption, and the perpetuation of flawed systems. Duty becomes a prison when it eliminates choice and reduces heroes to mere functions within cosmic machinery. Sacrifice becomes meaningless repetition when it serves systems rather than values, when it preserves forms while allowing substances to decay. Yet the stories also suggest that these risks do not negate the value of heroic action, but rather emphasize the importance of wisdom, compassion, and conscious choice in heroic endeavors. The Lords of Cinder, who retained their humanity and effectiveness, were those who understood what they were fighting for, not just what they were fighting against. The ultimate message of their collective story may be that heroism is not about achieving perfect outcomes or finding final solutions to cosmic problems. Instead, it is about responding to impossible situations with courage, wisdom, and genuine concern for others, accepting that the results of such action will always be imperfect, and that the struggle between light and dark, order and chaos, hope and despair will continue in new forms. The cycle of firelinking may be eternal, but it is not unchanging. Each iteration brings new challenges, new opportunities, and new possibilities for heroic action that honors the past while remaining open to future change. The Lords of Cinder, in all their diversity and complexity, represent the full spectrum of human response to ultimate challenges. Their stories remind us that in our own world, faced with our own impossible choices and cosmic uncertainties, the value of action lies not in its guarantee of success, but in its affirmation of values that make existence meaningful. Whether we choose to link the fire, let it fade, or seek new alternatives entirely, we do so as inheritors of a heroic tradition that teaches us to act with courage even when outcomes remain uncertain. And so, our journey through the tales of those heroes who fed the flame draws to a close. We have witnessed their triumphs and their failures, their wisdom and their folly, their sacrifices and their rewards. In their stories, we see reflections of our own struggles with duty and desire, individual and collective needs, the preservation of tradition, and the necessity of change. The Lords of Cinder achieved immortality not through avoiding death, but through embracing transformation. Their legacy lives on not in the permanence of their achievements, but in the inspiration their example provides to future heroes facing their own impossible choices. In the end, perhaps that is the most any hero can hope for: to light a flame that others can carry forward into the darkness ahead. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through the lore of Dark Souls. The legends of the Lords of Cinder continue to inspire and challenge us, reminding us that heroism is not about perfection, but about the courage to act with conviction in the face of uncertainty. Next time on Lore 2 RPG, we'll explore another corner of gaming's rich mythological landscape. Until then, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers, and may you find your own flame to carry into the darkness.